And I tried to be selective with my slides because I could talk about all of these topics for days, truly. But I'm not sure you really want to listen to me for that long. Whoops. So what I gotta do though is really quick get my settings fixed. Okay. So yeah, like Karen said, thanks so much for having me tonight. I'm really excited to be able to share select bits of the stuff I do and have done. And so I will be talking about some of the research that we've undertaken locally, as well as the national program. But we'll start at the beginning to make sure everybody's on the same page. What is phenology? And I'm very happy to answer this question because I get it all the time. It's such an awkward sounding word, but truthfully, it refers to a phenomenon that we're all intimately familiar with. Everybody on the planet is, whether you're really registered or not, you are paying attention to things like, when is it spring? Is it the start of fall? Has fall really kicked in? And how do we know that? Basically, we know it because we observe, first of all, things like the shortening of the days and the decrease in temperatures that we're finally starting to experience here, as well as the biological responses to those kinds of changes. So things like in my backyard, my desert willow is starting to finally show some signs of the leaves starting to dry out and get ready to drop off. And I think it just finally stopped flowering after giving us so many beautiful purple blossoms for months and months. And so phenology refers to the timing of these seasonal biological events in plants and animals. So it's really the things like when does that desert willow in my backyard put on its leaves? And is it earlier this year than normal or later than normal this year? When do insects migrate or lay their eggs? When do birds migrate? When do fruits ripen? That kind of stuff, as well as what's driving it, and are there changes that we can see? The reason why we care about phenology, or the timing of when stuff happens, is that generally what drives the timing of seasonal events in plants and animals is local conditions. In a lot of species, this has to do with how warm or cool it's been, as well as, especially in our area, how wet or dry it's been in recent weeks and months, and sometimes even longer than that. And so as those driving conditions are changing, species are responding and either advancing their phenology so that they're undergoing different seasonal events earlier in the year or delaying it. And if we can anticipate when different species are going to undertake seasonal changes, it can be really helpful for a whole host of applications, things like managing for invasive species. In a lot of species, they're most vulnerable to being treated when they're in a particular life cycle stage, like when their leaves are green, they can be treated with herbicide more effectively. Or being able to anticipate when different species will ripen their fruits can be really valuable for crop harvest. Things like festivals, like I had a lot of phone calls this past spring because it was such an early spring in the Southeast, and a lot of people had a lot of anxiety, truly, before COVID hit, about whether the cherry blossoms in the trees in the DC tidal basin area were going to flower earlier than the actual festival was planned for. And they were just freaking out because that's such a huge event, and they actually plan and set aside a couple of weeks every year for that event with a parade and everything. But if the peak of the blooms is past when that event actually occurs, it's less than ideal. And so, there's a ton of applications where just understanding when stuff is going to happen in different plants and animals can really be helpful for short-term or longer-term planning. Here's an example where some changes in phenology are actually impacting an ecosystem and ecosystem functioning. This is a three-way mutualism among three different species this is in Europe, where the English oak tree puts on its leaves in the spring in response to the accumulation of warmth. So in an extra warm year, the tree will put on its leaves earlier than average, and in a cool year, it might take longer to put on its leaves. Over centuries or millennia, the winter moth, which is a caterpillar that feeds specifically on English oak leaves, has evolved so that it emerges, the little caterpillar eggs hatch at the same time that those leaves come out, so it has something to eat. Then there's this pied flycatcher that depends on the winter moth as its main source of food. The pied flycatcher, though, spends its winter in the southern, I don't know if the southern hemisphere, but way south, and is cued to migrate north in the spring based on the angle of the sun. The angle of the sun isn't being affected by climate change. It's totally a function of where the Earth is on its migration around the sun over the course of the year. And so the pied flycatcher every year is flying north to get to its breeding ground in Europe the same time every year because it's being cued by that sun angle. But the thing is, because we're seeing increasing temperatures on average, those English oak leaves are coming out earlier and earlier now. And because those winter moths are actually pretty aware of this and are cued to follow the phenology of the English oak, they also are advancing their phenology. But the bummer is that the pied flycatcher, because it's cued to migrate north based on sun angle, which is not being affected by changing temperatures, it's still going at the same time each year. And in some locations, when it's arriving at its breeding ground, there's no more winter moths. The little caterpillars have already pupated and are, well on their way to turning into actual moths. And there's devastating impacts on the population sizes of this bird because they don't have any food to eat when they get to their breeding ground. And so we're seeing these kinds of changes in many plants and animals around the globe, and the consequent effects of these kinds of changes, as you can imagine, are still being discovered and definitely have the potential to be really pretty impactful. Which brings us to a local person here who has been keeping track of the timing of events in plants and animals for a very long time. I want to introduce you to my friend David Bertelson, who is a local naturalist who has been hiking the Finger Rock Trail in the Santa Catalina Mountains for so many times, thousands of times. He first started hiking in 1983. I think it was for fitness. And then he started keeping track of the plants that he was observing because he was interested. He was took pictures of the flowers because he was a photographer and thought it was fun. And then was intrigued to know what were the plants that he was seeing. Make a long story short, this has turned into an insanely rich data set. He has, on average, hiked this trail from bottom to top, which is over 4,000 feet elevation gain and 5 miles one way, on average, at least once a week since 1983, and since 1984 has kept track of every single species of plant that he has seen in flower within each of the mile-long segments on the trail every single time, which is really amazing. Simply the feat itself of hiking the same trail, the really difficult trail, that many times is incredible. But then the feat of keeping track of all of the plants is that much more amazing. And then the fact that this trail actually traverses this huge elevation gradient. And so as you can see, it goes from desert, scrub, and riparian communities at the bottom, in the bottom mile, up through grassland, then woodland, oak pine woodland, and all the way up to pine forest at the top, really makes it an incredible data set because it enables us to look at weather phenology, the timing of flowering in these plants has changed at all, and to see if it's changing similarly in these different plant communities or if the responses are different. And so I was fortunate, Mike and my husband, Mike, that you might have seen present a few months ago, who's a climatologist, and I had the real fortune to work with Dave for several years to analyze those data records and to see what kinds of changes we could tease out of this really rich, but semi non-traditional data set. You know, he didn't click it with the intention of documenting changes. He did it because he loved the plants and he liked hiking and he thought it was fun. And he's still doing this. He's still actively doing this. And so, you know, we kind of got creative with the statistics and the analyses, but we were able to document some really cool, amazing things. And some of the features of the data set that make it so important and so rigorous really is that it's all been collected by him. So you don't have to worry about observer bias, whether one person might notice the flowers more and another person might pay attention more to the trees. It's a very long duration now. At the time that I made this slide, he had done 1,300 round trips, but this is like a decade out of date now. I think he's closer to 2,000 on an approximately weekly basis. And the record that we evaluated had more than 150,000 unique observations of plants in flower along that gradient, which is huge. And so I will just talk briefly because we don't have that much time today and I have so much to say. But one of the many cool things that we did with this data set was one of the things he said early on to us was, I feel like I've seen things flower at higher elevations now than I used to. And I was, quickly said, well, let's test it. We can test for that actually, because the way you collected your data is in these mile-long segments that goes up the trail, up an elevation gradient. Let's just test it. And so we expected a couple of different kinds of changes, and we categorized them either as a range shift, where the elevation band of where he saw the plant in flower basically just got pushed up slope, where the bottom, the low elevation bound of it moved up, as well as the upper elevation bound. We looked to see if there are any species that just simply expanded their range uphill, or species that we did what we called range contraction, which meant that at their upper edge, they didn't go any higher, but that their lower elevation kind of scooched up where they weren't seen anymore at the lower elevation. And we looked for the inverse of this too, for species to shift downslope or contract or expand downslope, but we saw very little of that. In reality, we tested, I think we evaluated over 300 species in this analysis, and over a quarter of them showed a significant change. And this was just in a 20-year span. This was 1984 to 2003. And it would be amazing to redo this analysis with the more recent decades. So this is a pretty short period of time, relative to what you could do. And it was a period characterized by increasing summer temperatures, but not much else. Within that window, there wasn't a huge dramatic evidence of other seasons showing an increase in temperature. And there was actually even, I don't remember now, it's been so long. I think that the precipitation patterns were the kind of the opposite of what the longer term trends suggest, which are kind of going towards drier in certain seasons. And even so, we saw really clear changes. 12 species shifted their range upslope. 34 of them did the range expansion, where the upper bound climbed higher, and another 23 did the contraction thing, where they kind of scrunched up, basically, where the lowest elevation at which he had seen them in flower was no longer suitable for them to be in flower. And so that's a pretty compelling story, really, and it's actually consistent with what has been documented in there's not that many other studies that encompass an elevation gradient like this, or that have that long of a record to be able to evaluate. But definitely what we documented was consistent with what others have shown and what models predict too. And what we anticipate could come out of this is that things will just continue along these trends, given the fact that, the reason why the species are moving upslope is that they're trying to chase the conditions that are tolerable for them, and it's getting too hot. The lower elevations are just basically getting too warm or potentially too dry. But that the species are shifting at different rates and to different degrees. And so that affects your community composition. And you can have, species mixes that didn't exist together in previous decades, and that can confuse the pollinators and definitely cause problems for animals that depend on them for food sources. You can see reduced biodiversity because invasives are coming in and taking over, like the picture on the right is showing. And eventually there's not enough, there is a top to the mountain. So if things keep creeping up slope, eventually they just disappear. And it's not crazy to anticipate that that could happen in coming decades. And it's also increased threats to species that are already either threatened or endangered, and again, the spread of invasives. So I could talk a whole lot more about the great stuff that Dave has, that we've been able to document by examining that really rich record. But since we don't have a ton of time, I'll shift gears because Karen had also asked me to talk about the Phenology Network and specifically about stuff you can do to the Phenology Network. So I will shift here because I feel like what we did with Dave and what what his data show are really excellent, just an incredibly great example of what can be done on a much larger scale. And that's the inspiration behind the organization that I now direct, which is the USA National Phenological Network. We're an organization that has to date been federally funded. We're kind of in a weird space right now, but who isn't these days with funding and everything else? I think that uncertainty is just the word that will characterize 2020 more than anything else. Maybe you're muted too. But anyway, our organization was established back in 2007 because there's a growing recognition that plants and animals are indeed showing evidence of primarily advancing, but changing their phenology, changing the timing of when stuff is happening as a result of changing climate conditions. And it was referred to in a couple of really key reports early on by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and some other high profile papers that said, those kinds of changes, things like plants flowering earlier, are really the fingerprints of climate change. Those are the things that you're going to see first. And then you will also start to see the consequences, like the loss of species off the tops of mountains, or the decline in species numbers, like with the pied flycatcher example. But the first thing you're going to notice is stuff's happening earlier or at a different time than it used to. And so our organization was established basically to help document that. Our primary aim is to collect, store, and share phenology information and information, and make it available for others to better document it and understand, what drives this, why are things changing, what might we expect in the future, maybe what can we do about it, to support decisions, things like letting the folks that run the Tidal Basin Cherry Blossom Festival, yeah, it looks like you might be a week or two off this year, or letting folks know, yeah, because spring is popping early in the Northeast or the Southeast, there may be a greater risk for frost damage to crops, because if certain crops, if they start, blooming early because of a warm spring, and then a freeze comes that can decimate things like cherry trees and peach blossoms and peach crops. And in recent years, we've had horrible losses because of that kind of thing. We also exist to do this very thing right here, communicate about phenology and climate change, and help the general public understand what's going on here and why it's important. And then finally, our aim is to make sure that everything that we do reaches everybody. Hopefully, we're doing our best to try and ensure that the good that we bring to the world is distributed equitably. So one of the big things that we do is run this program called Nature's Notebook, which is, like Karen said, it is like the Christmas bird count, or I don't know if you've maybe heard of programs like iNaturalist, or what else? There are so many programs where, as a volunteer and as a non-expert in the field, you can play a role and contribute information. And so the way Nature's Notebook works is that we invite anybody to keep track of when stuff is happening in your backyard. Basically, how it works is that there are standardized protocols, which means we ask you specific questions about what you're seeing on certain species, but there happen to be a lot of good choices for the Tucson area because we're based here. And then we have a lot of training and support available to help you get going, and then to keep going and see what your data are showing, and see how people are using the data. So I didn't make a bunch of slides on this, but I can kind of talk you through it quickly. And then if there's interest, I can even go on the website and kind of walk you through how you get started and what it looks like. But to date, this program launched in 2009, and this is already out of date. We're over 23 million records now have been submitted from all across the country and actually beyond, because you can participate from outside of the US, but since we're the USA National Phenological Network, I kind of cut the map off there. But you can see where the data have come in from. The different color circles represent more records coming from certain locations, because some individuals are extremely dedicated. And it also, in a lot of locations, we have groups of folks participating. They come together, and we have that happen. We have that a lot active here in Tucson, so I can talk about that too. But folks come together and participate rather than as individuals, as a group. So the general steps for how to participate in Nature's Notebook are that you set up an account online, which only requires an email address. And then you set up your account, which means the next step is that you identify a site where you would want to observe. And typically we encourage folks to make this as convenient as possible. And so mine is my yard. And then once you have a site set up, you identify individual plants that you're going to make repeated observations on, or you can opt to add animals to the list that you think you may encounter. And so for me, I have about 5 individual trees in my backyard that I regularly observe. One's a desert willow, one's a lime tree, one's a grapefruit tree, one's a lemon tree. What else do I have on here? I'm already forgetting, I should really know this. Oh, a Texas Ranger, which was a lot of fun to track this spring or this summer. And then I think, oh gosh, I can't remember it. I'm forgetting. Anyway, there are a lot of plants in this area that are available for monitoring. And then once you've got them set up, and I generally advise people to do this on your computer just because it's easier than on your phone. But once it's all set up, you can download the app, and then you can log data from your app. So I just take my phone out to my yard and walk around the trees and answer the questions, yes or no. And the questions are things like, do you see leaves on this tree? Yes or no. Do you see flowers or flower buds? Yes or no. Do you see open flowers? Yes or no. So this is just a quick example of what it looks like when you're setting it up on your computer. And I probably should have fixed this. I have a number of sites set up, and so this is showing me all the different sites where I have set up to log data. And that at this particular site where I was collecting data at the Tanque Verde Guest Ranch, I have a whole list of species that I could make observations on. And so this is kind of like your landing page. And again, maybe it may look a little overwhelming, but I'm happy to walk you through this. We've got probably about, I think it's about 20,000 people that have contributed data over the years. And
good for you.
Over 500 different groups of individuals have been contributing data in recent years, representing a whole bunch of different institutions and government agencies. And we offer formal training for them as well. And then, I may not need to go into great detail on this, but if you are so inclined, you can also access all of these data readily and freely and download it and do whatever you want with it. And so the little animation on the right is walking you through how to download the data through an online interface that we have. And then if you're interested, you can then bring it into Excel or statistical software. Generally though, folks are more interested in just seeing pretty pictures. And so we also have this online visualization tool on our website where you can go in and plot things and either look at maps or explore patterns over time or through space. And so this animation is plotting last year. It's plotting common milkweed flowering time with presence of monarchs flying. And so if you look along the x-axis, these are the months. And the takeaway basically was that the two things did coincide last summer. I think this was for a fairly large swath of the Western US. And so it enables you to see that, yes, indeed, there were milkweed flowers available for the most part when the monarchs were active. One of the things that we do within Nature's Notebook is there are close to, I think my slide said 1,400, but I think it's closer to 2,000 species are available for monitoring. So you can monitor whatever you want from among the species on that list. We also run a series of campaigns that focus on certain species for certain reasons. And in our region right now, we have several active campaigns. One is called Flowers for Bats, which invites folks to track basically the flowering. It's pretty much focused on the flowering of saguaros and agaves, because those are important nectar sources for the lesser long-nosed bat. And those data are really important for the US Fish and Wildlife Service to use as they're monitoring the lesser long-nosed bat. We also have Nectar Connectors, which is a campaign focused on tracking the availability of important nectar plants and their flowering time for migrating pollinators like monarch butterflies, but other pollinators too. We have the Green Wave campaign, which focuses primarily on maples, oaks, and poplars. So that's a little trickier to achieve in your backyard unless you happen to have one of those species growing. And then Pest Control, which is one that's focused on a lot of noxious species. And Buffelgrass is the primary one that is of relevance here. And speaking of Buffelgrass, just very briefly, one of the many things that we do, in addition to getting people to collect the data on the ground of observations of when stuff is happening on individual plants and animals, we also produce a whole series of real-time maps and forecasts for when stuff is going to happen. And one of those really locally relevant forecasts that we make through the summer is when Buffelgrass is likely to be green. And that is because it is most effectively treated by herbicide when it is green. And managers that manage a lot of different properties, like for example, Pima County, they have so many different pieces of property distributed around the county. And they said, you know, gosh, it'd be so helpful if we knew which property we should go to prioritize treatment, but we don't know, you know, where it's most, which ones are most likely to have the green Buffelgrass without going out and scouting and having people drive all over the county every week. And so we launched this it's kind of a pilot product at this point, but we launched this product that predicts when different locations should have, where the Buffelgrass should have reached sufficient greenness to be treated by herbicide. And then finally, because I don't want to take up too much of your time, I thought I'd just give you just a teeny peek into who's using all these data and how, because we now have 23 million records of plant and animal phenology spanning back to 2009. So it's a good, decent chunk of time now. It's not a hugely long record if you're trying to estimate trends, but because it's spatially extensive and covers the whole US, it is a fairly rich data set, and it enables a lot of analysis and discovery. And one of my favorite recent examples of this is a paper that was just published earlier this year, where this was a graduate student at the time at Penn State University who said, I'm really interested in tracking and understanding whether invasive shrubs in eastern deciduous forests green up earlier in the season, in the spring, than native shrubs, and whether they hold on to their green leaves later in the season than the native shrubs, and if that is important or not. And she could have simply tracked as many shrubs in as many locations there in Pennsylvania as she could have managed. But she was smart and she reached out to us and said, hey, I have this project. Could you help me collect more data? And we said, sure. And so we ran one of those campaigns through Nature's Notebook, and we invited our participants from across the country. We said, hey, if you're interested, here's a list of shrubs that you could tell us when you see green, when you see the leaves turn green, both the invasives and the natives, and that would help the student out. And she ended up getting data from, I don't know, like 800 sites or something. I can't count those dots, but it was a lot. And she was able to do this really cool analysis where the graph on the right is showing that indeed the invasive shrubs, which is the purple line, do put their leaves on earlier than the native shrubs. This is the green line. The day of year is on the y-axis, the up-down axis. And so the fact that the purple is lower means that it's happening earlier in the year. But what the x-axis is latitude. And so what this shows is that the higher you go in latitude, the less there is a difference between the leaf out timing in the natives versus the invasives. And the fact that invasives leaf out earlier than natives was something that was already known, but this interaction with latitude is novel, and it was really cool that she was able to document that using data mainly contributed by Nature's Notebook volunteers. And so we are, I think, approaching 100 different papers like that now that have used data contributed to Nature's Notebook in some way. And those are all listed on our website. And we do a lot of summarization of them too. We usually, for a lot of the papers, we write little summaries that kind of translate and simplify it. Not simplify the science, but try to just make the language a little more approachable so that folks can understand, like, here's how your data are being used. And some of the most common ways that they're used are either to figure out what the drivers of phenology are, because funny enough, in a lot of species, we aren't really sure. For example, in the spring in the east, generally we know that plants don't put on leaves and flowers until it gets warm enough. So we know that warmth has something to do with it, but it's often more complicated than that. It's warmth if the days are long enough, or warmth if it's been wet enough. And so there's a lot of fundamental basic research going into trying to just document what those drivers are. There are also a lot of studies that are just documenting how the phenology of species is changing. Is it advancing? If so, are all the species in a community advancing at the same rate? That's hardly ever the case. Are species that are advancing also increasing in abundance and becoming more common in the landscape or not? And, what are the relationships there? And then finally, another way that these data are commonly used is as a way to ground truth what is being seen from sensors that are mounted either on drones or airplanes or satellites. Since it's a cool program, we've been lucky enough to be highlighted in a number of programs like SciGirls on PBS and a couple of other series that have focused specifically on phenology. And so we're grateful for that, and that helps us recruit new participants. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we're really hopeful, we're really aiming to ensure that the benefits of what we do accrue to people from all backgrounds reflected in the US population. And with that, hopefully that wasn't super long. I will stop, and I'm happy to take questions, or like I said, walk you through things if you would like me to.
I had to unmute myself. That was great. That's fascinating. I don't know about the rest of you, but I could have heard more, and I'd love to participate. So there's one question from Barbara in the chat, and she asked, what is it with the Texas Rangers? They used to tell us when it is going to rain. What is it with them?
I don't know. My experience is that they tell us when it did rain. It seems to me like they really bloom really pretty quickly in response to the monsoon rains. But I've only been here I've lived here for 15 years. No, I guess closer to 20 now. But I don't know if that's long enough to really like register those kinds of changes. So tell me what your experience is.
I was concerned, the Texas Ranger, but I was also concerned about those Palo Verde bugs, because I read they come out just before the rains or right when the rains come, and they come out to breed, and then they die. And so I thought without the rains, then things like Palo Verde bugs and other species like that didn't breed as well or something. I mean, a kind of a cascading effect.
Yeah, I don't know what their cues are, honestly. And I don't know if anybody knows. It may be one of those species where we think yeah, we just kind of associate it with the rains because that's when we tend to see them.
Uh-huh.
I don't know for sure. I did see a few this year. I always find them dead in the pool. And we had 3 or 4 nasty dead ones in the pool this year.
Oh, they're scary.
Yeah, they are. But yeah.
I have a lot of Texas Rangers on my property in the Commons area also where I live. And I always notice that when the flowers start coming out, they can wait a day or so and it's going to rain. So they always precede. They're kind of the rain is coming. That's my experience.
That is cool. You know, I may be wrong and you may be right. And I am now intrigued to kind of dig into this more. I know for a fact, I just very recently learned that another common name for them is Texas barometer bush. Have you heard that before?
Texas what?
Barometer bush, which
No.
seems very, it's following the same line of thinking because barometers are those indicators of drops in the atmospheric pressure, which has to do with rain. So, yeah, I'm intrigued. I'm gonna have to look into that, and I'll get back to you if I find anything.
I have another question from Claudia Stone. Is brittle bush now considered an invasive? It is taking over my foothills neighborhood.
Huh. Not to my knowledge, but I don't, that's no, I know it's native. I know it's from this neck of the woods, at least within the span of time that we define that. I could see though where when conditions change, and they are changing, certain species benefit. Certain species can say, "Hey, this is my game. This is like the right conditions for me," and it just might be one of those that is able to really respond and increase in abundance, whereas others are not so happy with the kind of hotter, drier conditions we seem to be experiencing as of late.
I have one more chat question, then we'll just open up the open mic. From Oliver, great presentation, thanks. Do you know any classes, groups, or resources for learning local native plants, edible natives, or gardening with them?
I will have to give that a little bit of thought, but could I follow up with you, Karen, when I—
Yes, absolutely.
And then, yeah, I'm thinking there must be stuff through Extension, U of A Extension.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, does anyone else know? Please chime in if you do.
I think the Extension would be the best bet.
Probably free, or low cost.
Yeah, we go in there and talk to people who are working on these things too.
Well, there is a Tucson Organic Gardeners group, so they might know.
Yeah.
And that's online. Anyway, so please unmute yourself if you have more questions.
Another resource might be the Master Gardener program that they have.
I was just going to say, yeah, there's also a Master Naturalist program, kind of parallel, but the focus is more on, I think, broader naturalism. And both of those are through Extension and are really reasonably priced and really good information. Actually, one of my team members, who's our education coordinator, Lorianne Barnett, is the director for the Arizona Master Naturalists as well. So I know it's good content and there's overlap. She gets Master Naturalists familiar with Nature's Notebook.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very informative. We're going to follow through.
Okay, thanks. Feel free to follow up if you have questions at any juncture. It's a lot. I said a lot of stuff, but I barely scratched the surface. So if you get intrigued and you get stuck on the website at all, just shout. We've got people that can help.
Is the NPN part of the USGS, or is they're a sponsor also?
Yeah, so for up until this year, they were our primary funder.
Okay.
They're now kind of scaling back, but yeah, I haven't redone the slides yet. For many years, since they were the primary funder, we gave them kind of top billing on all of our outreach materials.
Okay.
We are now, though, fully and completely rooted and based at the University of Arizona.
How much do you integrate the rain, the El Niños, La Niñas, and the heat index with all these things? Because like all my agaves died. I have this beautiful agave succulent garden, and they all died. There was not enough rain. It was so hot they couldn't survive. So how much of that are you integrated with your studies, in your studies?
First of all, I'm really sorry about your plants. I cannot believe how terrible the vegetation looks and everything. You know, like even the hardiest stuff in my yard, like the stupid oleanders look horrible. And I have a hard time watering an oleander.
Yeah.
But, you know, stuff like the creosotes out in the wash, they just look so bad. So I'm sorry to hear about your agaves, but I'm not surprised.
If you like.
For the data that we offer, for the most part, what we do is either make the observational data available and others can integrate it with things like heat index or precipitation data and look for patterns. Or we do also make some derivative kind of synthetic products. And in those cases, we do take that kind of stuff into account. But it's most of those products that we have made so far are national in scope, and so are less suited in truth for our area. It's just easier to make forecasts for things that are temperature driven, because temperature just behaves a whole lot more predictably than moisture and precipitation. And in our area, as you're probably extremely well aware, temperature isn't, for the most part, the limiting factor, except for when it gets too hot. It's the lack of moisture that really has the greatest impact on whether plants do their thing and put on flowers or leaves. And so there's a lot of unrealized opportunity for us. However, going back to the work that we did with Dave Bertelson's data from the Finger Rock Trail, we did pay attention to both temp and precip in that kind of work. And what we documented was not surprising. Basically, the very short of it was how much it rains in the previous seasons really matters for whether things are going to flower.
Sure.
Real quick, Jana said that Sustainable Tucson's page, I guess your website, they post classes about native plants. Desert Harvesters teaches how to respectfully harvest edible native plants. I have a question. There was a study, and it was a really, really initial study of the saguaros on Tumamoc.
Yeah.
You remember that earlier this year?
Yeah,
And it noticed, and I can't remember.
Right?
Yeah, it said that they noticed, and I can't remember what seedlings are called. I think there's a word for little saguaros. That they were appearing on the north slopes, which was unusual. Okay. But my question is, in that study, it also said that with the saguaros, they have to track the plants around them, like you know, the nurse plants, the palo verde that protect the growth of the saguaro. That would be important for the plants to have their own little, what do you call it, little biome to go with them, to move with them. Is that something you know about or talk about, or?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, our program isn't really set up, unfortunately, to track those kinds of interactions among species. If folks were interested in tracking the phenology, so baby saguaros are pretty darn boring because they don't do anything. I think the protocol for saguaro only asks about when it's putting on the flower buds, when they're open. Right. And I don't even know if it talks about arm generation. You know, it's really limited because they just don't do that much seasonally. Yeah. But you know, you would track the individual saguaro plant, and then you would track the individual nurse plant that was associated with it. And then you just kind of have to know, like, oh, these two go together, and you can look and see if there are relationships in how they're responding. But Yeah, what you described sounds right.
Yeah, they were saying it was too hot. You know, the certain slopes were, I guess, south facing were just so hot
Yeah.
for the plants that they had to move. And it's really sad about, I don't know how long this would take, but the idea that the vegetation at the top of the Catalinas will just die. They have no place to go. This is kind of a sad thought.
So, it's not a done deal. That's just, if we were to extrapolate what we documented, that's a logical extrapolation, just drawing that line out. But I think that there's still time to turn the tide and
Sure.
fend that off. So I'm hoping I'm rooting for the
No, that's good. That's good. Thinking positive. I'm thinking positive 2 weeks from now. Now I can think positive a year from now.
Exactly.
How about animals and birds and other critters? Are you integrating all of that in your observations?
Yes, so we do have a number of birds, mammals, amphibians and reptiles, some fish, and some insects that you can observe through nature's notebook. Some of those taxonomic groups are more represented than others, basically because of the trouble identifying them. Birds are the ones that are most typically observed, because I think people love birds anyways. They're really commonly observed species anyways. And it's just easier to identify distinct bird species than it is, say, mayflies or even certain butterflies, or so many other things. Yeah, there's this tension where a lot of the species that really have the most utility for knowing when they're undergoing different life cycle stages, things like vectors of disease like ticks or mosquitoes, are incredibly hard for people to monitor. Some of those species you need to have them under a dissecting scope to know what the heck they are. So we haven't really invested a lot in encouraging people to track those kinds of species. And we also definitely steer folks away and don't encourage observing on anything dangerous like rattlesnakes or bears. And we also don't include threatened or endangered species or anything with real strong cultural significance, because we don't want the populations to get diluted. But yeah, there's like squirrels are in there and chipmunks and become more common things. And I don't know. I should look. The data that we actually have is much more representative of plants than it is animals. So I don't know how much the animal data have actually been analyzed. And I don't know. I'm not thinking of anything off the top of my head that really has documented very clear changes in animal phenology, specifically using the data that have been contributed to Nature's Notebook. But we're hopeful that that will get used in that way, and are trying to encourage that.
People were looking at bats and birds as migratory critters, that their migratory patterns may be changing a lot too.
Yes. Yep. That's definitely documented. There was a paper that just came out like a week ago that said something about birds needing to advance their migration time, but if they
hold on 1 second, I'm on a Zoom call that I'm thinking about getting off anyway.
They don't have resources.
I'm just going to mute everything.
Available. So yeah, yes, there's definitely data. The data for animals. Typically, I think the research is relying upon observations that have been contributed to eBird and other programs that are more commonly used than ours. But yes, you're right. There's a lot of documentation of changes in the timing of when things are happening, and then consequent changes to impacts to population sizes and that kind of thing.
I don't know how to get on the screen.
Marilyn?
And then there's people.
Yeah.
Marilyn, do you have a question?
I do. I'm just trying to figure out how to frame this. So I'm kind of vacillating between California, which is my homeland. I was born in Pasadena and lived there for years. And then the state that I've lived more more recently and longer now is Arizona, from Flagstaff to Prescott and now to Tucson for the last 30 years. So, let's see, because we had the fire up at Mount Lemon too, and I drive up there 3 days a week to take my dogs to hikes because it's so much cooler, and when I visioned the after the fire, how much destruction there was and how far it went and how close it got to the little town and everything like that. I mean, it was just, I cried all the way down the hill. I just went, oh my God. And of course, having come from, before I came here, I lived in Idlewild, and we had that fire that was 2 years ago. And that fire that just ran up the hill and came right up the arts and science, academy had to close down. They had it was during the summer, they had the science camp up there, the astronaut camp, whatever they call it up there. All the kids that were there, they were bussed down the hill. We were evacuated for 10 days, and I came, and because I was struggling with lung cancer, which is to be abated now, terminal lung cancer, I came back up after 10 days because I went down and stayed with my daughters, but they were evacuated too, because one lives in Malibu and one lives in Topanga Canyon, and they were evacuated. Yeah. So then I had to go somewhere else. And so then when I came back, I just put my house on the market, sold it, and left, because anyway, so I'm kind of rambling, but so given the fires now, because I also owned a home in Mendocino, and then that was when Clear Lake burned, and then I had to get out of there. I mean, it's just it's like the fire, and then I come down here, and then it's Mount Lemon. And so given that, does that accelerate climate change? I mean, how long does it take for environmental reparation, regrowth, and that to happen so that things can regrow? And meanwhile, the flora and fauna that has been burned, I mean, doesn't it take years? And then is that kind of like a drought, because everything is killed from the fire? So isn't that like things being killed from a drought, and then because there's no there's no rain coming back and everything? I mean, doesn't that just accelerate the whole debacle?
So things are crazy right now. I think that's what you're describing.
Yeah.
And I'm laughing, but it's a very serious situation.
Oh, yeah.
What you're describing. Yeah. I am not a fire ecologist, and I'm not an expert on this stuff at all. But my understanding is the reasons why we're having such massive, devastating fires right now is for a number of reasons. It's kind of like the convergence of a lot of factors. One being that we've had decades of fire suppression in ecosystems that actually were built to burn. The top of the Catalinas being one example of that, and definitely a lot of California too. Historically, kind of pre-1900s, those ecosystems did burn every few years to every 10 years, and they were big burns, and they cleared out a lot of the underbrush and they kept them open. But then we had our Smokey Bear campaigns, and there was basically this attitude for decades that fire is bad, and we suppress it, and so all that stuff grows up, and then you have this huge accumulation of fuels. And then when that burns, it burns much hotter, so it's much harder to actually put back out. They are much bigger fires, and yeah, they are more devastating. What I understand is that when fires are really hot, yes, you can have the soils mineralized, and a lot of the soils are not just dirt. There's all these microbes, and fungi, and all these important little critters in there. They can get killed. And then you're right, it is a lot harder for things to recover, because you're not just trying to restore the trees or the underbrush, you've got everything that has to recover. Also, yes, it's been very, very, very hot and dry. Really hot, dry conditions over many subsequent seasons. has that compounding effect too of making things much more likely to burn. And so,
And I had one other question because I am such a toxin freak. And I don't totally organic gardening and have for a long time. And sometimes a little bit of organic fertilizer, but generally I don't even do fertilizer or anything like that. So they're spraying herbicides, you're saying, on buffalo grass. So is that a non-chemical, non-toxic herbicide?
unfortunately, no, it's glyphosate. It's the one that Monsanto was getting lawsuits brought against them over for cancer. No, it's a nasty one.
I mean, that seems counterproductive, tremendously
Yeah.
counterproductive for protecting our.
Yeah, another way that Buffelgrass actually is controlled year round is by hand pulling. Those are the two best ways to control it. Mowing, cutting, burning definitely do not work.
Now I'm going to segue over to this. I just bought 4 buffalo. I love buffalo grass. It grows all over Topanga Canyon where my daughter lives, and it's gorgeous.
Buffalo.
Huh? I'm sorry?
I think she said Buffelgrass. If it's the plant that we're referring to, it's Pennisetum ciliare, that's the Latin name for it.
That gets the kind of purplish.
Yeah, you might have gotten fountain grass, which is a related species.
It's fountain grass.
Okay.
But fountain grass looks a lot like buffalo grass because I just bought some to put in and then I'm saying, and like they're spraying herbicide, but okay, it's 2 different things.
Well, it's not a lot better, honestly. I think they're both pretty devastating on the landscape. The reason why those grasses are not ideal for this ecosystem is that the Sonoran Desert, in its native state, won't carry a fire. There isn't continuous vegetation. There's a lot of space between the plants. And so if lightning hits, for example, you might have a local fire, but it won't pick up and carry a fire for acres or more. But bufflegrass does fill in those spaces between the cacti, between saguaros and agaves and other native shrubs, and accumulates a lot of biomass season after season that is very burnable. And so once fires get started, it can burn a whole landscape, and actually is a threat to structures, to foothills homes and things. It was not a major factor in the Bighorn fire, they were saying, because the fire was mainly at higher elevations than where the bufflegrass was. But I think there was concerns when it was coming down Ventana Canyon that if it hit bufflegrass, it could really spread. And the problem is then when plants like saguaros burn, they die, they explode because they're not used to fire. So that's bad.
Real quick. Mark said that he thinks that the National Park Service oversees some programs for bufflegrass removal by hand pulling. And Jana, in terms of classes about native plants, check out Sustainable Tucson's Facebook page. So a couple little updates.
Yeah.
On your website, you have a little section on the bufflegrass, and you mentioned that they flower when it rains. I can't remember, but that this year it was late flowering. Would that have been?
Oh my gosh, we had little bufflegrass, very little bufflegrass response this year because there was so very little rain. Yeah, Perry Grissom is an ecologist, I think a fire ecologist at Saguaro National Park, and we've been in regular contact with him, and he was saying, yeah, I mean, it's a good thing from the perspective of there wasn't a lot of spread of bufflegrass, and they were able to get in and hand pull it and try and kind of make some progress on controlling it. But he also said it was just so hot that it was really hard to have crews out, and total non-soon definitely has a lot of other negative impacts to all the other species that need rain, like every one of them. So
can't win. Yeah, what is that Monsanto?
Glyphosate,
Glyphosate, right?
Roundup.
Roundup,
Yes.
Roundup.
Yes.
It causes
Like-
lung cancer, and there's some major lawsuits in California about this that have been won. It
Well,
causes.
they've
lung
got a
cancer.
Monsanto plant. Don't they have a big plant up Marana, and they're growing corn? We've got in our own backyard, we've got Monsanto testing.
Wow.
Well, it's a huge, huge company. I think they do a
Yeah.
lot of, make chemicals and also do genetically modified crops and all sorts of things that we may not be super excited about.
Yeah. Some things. And so, anyone else? Is everyone pretty clear on how to sign? Oh, go ahead, Bev. Is that Bev? I can't see.
Kurt, it's Kurt.
Kurt, hi.
Hi. Bev, whatever. No, if you want to volunteer for the program, is it critical that you make year-round observations? That's the reason I'm asking is my wife and I spend part of the year, up in the Northwest.
Gotcha.
So is
No.
the partial year data collection still valuable?
Yeah. We're the kind of program where we'll take whatever we can get. We encourage folks to track, I think the guidelines on the website say make observations 2 to 4 times a week. I'm lucky if I do it once a week or once every 2 weeks, but I try to pay attention when something's about to change. Like, for example, springtime is a lot of fun because I really want to catch the date on which my desert willow first opens a flower. And that's what matters, really. Having a bunch of, it's not that fun to log a whole bunch of no's through the winter, because the way it works is that, again, you're answering those yes, no questions. Do you see open flowers, yes or no? And honestly, through the summer and through the winter, it's kind of boring because it's a lot of no's. So yeah, basically part of the year is fine, and even part of the season is fine. Because what our aim is if we have such a huge amount of data, you kind of lose those gaps, they kind of get lost in the shuffle. I'm not sure we're really there yet, but that's the aim. So yeah, if you're interested, we would love to have you.
I guess I could do Oregon when we're up there then too.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much, unless there's any other questions. Oh, I want to thank you so much, Theresa. It was it's fascinating. I would love to participate. I'd have to go somewhere. Now, in your list, you had the book festival. Was that you just did the mall?
Oh, the Crouch Gardens. There is a site, yeah. The reason why that's on there is there are a few cacti, and well, actually, it's a number of plants in the Crouch Gardens right on the mall of U of A that a lot of the classes on campus track, and so they're tagged. They actually have little tags on there with the Nature's Notebook logo, and so if you have interest in monitoring, say there or at a place where plants have already been registered.
Yeah.
It is much, much better if we work with you to gain you access to those so that you're contributing data to the same plants within the database rather than re-registering them. And so, yeah, if you're interested in that, just let me know. And there's actually a number of places in Tucson and in the surrounding area where that is a possibility. The Botanical Garden is one. Biosphere 2 is another. The Mission Garden. The Santa Rita Experimental Range, a bunch of schools in the area. I have to send you a page. We actually call it the Tucson Phenology Trail, though it's not really a trail. It's just a agglomeration of a lot of different sites that have this. But yeah, you can either monitor in your own yard or join many others who are tracking plants at those sites.
Great. Okay, I like that idea too. Marilyn? Do you have a question?
Unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm actually going to the Mission Garden tomorrow, and I went to the refuge, or I don't call it the refugee garden, but the one down on Maple Street. I went to that today because I'm going to start watering on Saturday, be a Saturday waterer, and they're in conjunction with Mission Garden too. So my question is is this a weekly observation? And
It can be at whatever frequency you're comfortable pulling off.
oh, okay. And then you just make it clear, of course.
Yep.
That
Yeah, yeah.
week or whatever, because I'm really excited to see Mission Gardens. I've heard
Cool.
about that. So, you know, so that might be a possibility for me to get involved in that way. Yeah.
That would be great. We would love to have you.
Okay, well, I'm going to say good evening, and again, thank you so much. This is really interesting. I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming to tonight's meeting. I am thinking, I don't know, I'm thinking of having one toward the end of the month, just an open mic to discuss win or lose, what are we going to do next? Because whatever happens politically, we still have to power through with our dedication to protecting the earth and the climate. So it'll be posted if I get the nerve to. I don't think anyone will show up. Everybody will be too nervous. But anyway, possible. So again, thanks so much. Thank you everyone for coming.
Take care.
Have a
Thanks
good
so
night.
much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.